I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews, and you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show. That's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, I welcome back Robert Lustig, Professor Emeritus at UC San Francisco of Pediatric Endocrinology and author of a host of peer-reviewed articles and reviews and a number of widely admired and acclaimed and best-selling books, including Metabolical, Fat Chance, and The Hacking of the American Mind. A longtime warrior for eating healthy food and avoiding the deleterious dangers of sugar and processed foods, Dr. Lustig holds a BA in Science from MIT, an MD from Cornell, and a Master of Law degree from UC Hastings College of Law. He did postdoctoral research in neuroendocrinology. He was co-author of the 2009 American Heart Association Guideline to Sugar Intake and is former chair of the Obesity Task Force of the Pediatric Endocrine Society, as well as having been on the steering committee of the International Endocrine Alliance to Combat Obesity. And I welcome Robert Lustig back to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Good to see you.
Great to see you. Like I said, we got to do this more often.
Well, we will, perhaps. Some announcements we're going to be making soon about some changes which may indeed cater to that.
Okay.
I want to talk first about your evolution, though. I was going back and looking at your history, and I realized 2009 was kind of a key year. It really put you in the spotlight and really began to put you into a role of what you've become, which is kind of a food guru. I use those words advisedly, but, being really foursquare against sugar and processed foods. And it goes back to your work with childhood obesity, I think, doesn't it? All of this?
Indeed, yeah. So, 2009 was a watershed year because that was the year I gave this lecture at UCSF as part of their mini med school for the public called Sugar the Bitter Truth, which is still online. You can access it now. And, there were 200 people in the audience, and I figured that was that. And I didn't even know there was a camera in the back the entire time, or I would have worn a better tie. I got more flack for the tie than anything else.
I'm sorry, but what was the tie?
It was silver. My mother had given it to me, so I wore it. And it just was a little glaring and garish, I guess. But in any case, I thought, that was the end of that. And all of a sudden, UCSF posted it to YouTube. And, now it's got 25 million views. And it's sort of, I guess, went more than viral. And it sort of started me in a different direction. I mean, I was doing the science, but I wasn't really an advocate at that point.
You became an advocate also with that New York Times article, which got an enormous number of hits. I think it set a record, in fact.
Right, yeah. Gary Taubes wrote an article about our research at UCSF in 2011 called Is Sugar Toxic? And obviously, that's highly controversial. Even today.
Yes, it remains controversial.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of vested interests in, sort of keeping things the way they are. But we have the data. It's both toxic and addictive and ubiquitous and has what we call externalities, that is, negative impact on society. Those are the 4 criteria one needs to regulate any given substance.
And you have convinced many people of those as being axiomatic almost, really, and truthful, and have quite a number of followers. In fact, we're not only talking about sugar and ultra-processed foods, which we'll get into, but also I just saw a recent podcast you did with Andrew Huberman, and you were talking about, it was almost nostalgic for me hearing you talking about mitochondria and cyanide. I remember an interview I did with James Watson about mitochondria. You're talking about butter is back and margarine is out again. And
right.
I mean, you've been taking things into all kinds of areas. I mean, extraordinary.
Well, I'll tell you, think of it this way. For 40 years, modern medicine told us that genetics would solve our medical problems. It didn't. If anything, things are worse. And the reason is because all of the chronic diseases that we are suffering from today, and I'll list them for you: type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease. Those 8 diseases currently account for 75% of all healthcare dollars spent in America, which is right now at $4.1 trillion a year. And turns out none of those are genetic. And none of those have a treatment. We have symptomatic relief, like, for instance, statins lowering LDL or oral hypoglycemics lowering blood glucose. But the fact of the matter is, none of those are actually treating the inherent pathology that caused those symptoms in the first place. They're all just Band-Aids. They're not actually either treatments or cures. And the reason is because genetics are not the problem. The problem, or every one of those diseases that I just rattled off, are diseases of the mitochondria. And we have basically ignored this issue, and to our own detriment and peril. And we got to basically fix it. And the problem is there's only one way to fix it. Make your mitochondria work better. And the only way to do that is fix the food.
Well, you've been talking a lot about insulin too, though, haven't you?
Well, so insulin goes up when your mitochondria are defective, because if you can't burn the glucose all the way to ATP and carbon dioxide, which of course is the reaction of life, if that's being inhibited in some fashion, that means there's a backup of substrate that can't get through. So something has to happen to it. It gets converted to fat. And then that fat ends up being either deposited in fat cells, which then contributes to obesity, or it gets deposited in the liver, so you end up with fatty liver disease and insulin resistance, or it ends up being deposited in, arterial sclerotic plaques. So then you end up with heart disease instead.
But you mentioned fat cells, and I wonder to what extent are fat cells linked to genetics? And also, I have diabetes too, and I probably have it maybe because of the way I ate to a great extent, but also my mother and all four of her sisters had diabetes. So there is, a strong genetic link in so many of these things, isn't there?
Turns out that diabetes actually does not have that strong a genetic link. Okay, 15% of the variance in diabetes is considered genetic. That means 85% is environmental. So there is a genetic component. I'm not saying there isn't. But in fact, the environmental component dwarfs the genetic component by quite a bit. Now, you asked a different question. Let's go back to it. You said, what's the genetic contribution to obesity? And that we know because we do have all these twin studies. And the answer is 50%. But there are 3 separate fat depots, and we have to basically dissect those out. And let's talk about each one separately, because that's kind of where the nugget of truth is. And I know, it's a little science, and I hope the audience will forgive me, but, there's no other way to understand it. So there are 3 different fat depots. One is called subcutaneous fat, or big butt fat. One is called visceral fat, or big belly fat. And the last one is called liver fat. And those 3 are not the same. Now, subcutaneous fat, big butt fat, that's the part that's 50% genetic. So your, shall we say, your dress size can be genetic, because that's a, compendium of your subcutaneous fat. Your visceral fat does not really contribute to your dress size. And certainly your liver fat does not contribute to your dress size. Turns out that subcutaneous fat is cardiovascularly and metabolically neutral. This is where your body wants to put the fat.
That's the good fat, basically.
In essence, it's the good protective fat. And, fat can be very protective. Ask any little old lady who breaks her hip if she wishes she had a little bit more fat. And the answer is, yeah, damn right. So that fat turns out to be not the problem. Yet that's the fat that's genetic. Conversely, the visceral fat and the liver fat are almost exclusively not genetic. There are almost no genetics involved in whether you lay down visceral fat or liver fat. So what's the visceral fat due to? It turns out visceral fat's all stress and cortisol. It's not even food. And the reason we know that is, number one, Cushing's syndrome, which is a disorder of the adrenal gland where you make too much cortisol. And also, endogenous depression. So these are people who have to be admitted to the hospital to save them from themselves, for fear of suicide. They are anhedonic. They are not eating, so they are losing weight because they're losing subcutaneous fat, because that's what they're living off of, because they're not eating. And you stick them in a scanner, and sure, you see the weight loss in the subcutaneous fat, but their visceral fat's actually getting bigger. So how can their visceral fat be getting bigger if they're losing weight? And the answer is because the visceral fat is not related to weight. It's related to cortisol. And that is one of the reasons why lots of people are normal weight, but have all the same diseases as the ones that I rattled off before. And then finally, you have the liver fat. And it turns out the liver fat is the most egregious of all because it's at ground zero for energy metabolism, the liver. And so a little liver fat drives a lot of chronic disease. And the question is, what made the liver fat? And the answer is two things: sugar and alcohol. So, yeah, calories can play a role in subcutaneous fat. Genetics can play a role in subcutaneous fat. Who cares? Okay? Because that's not the cardiometabolically active fat. That's not the fat we really care about at a medical level. It's the fat that the patient cares about at a cosmetic level. That's true. But from a medical standpoint, that fat is actually the good part. It's the visceral and the liver fat that we really have to take care of. And we're not. We've ignored it.
Lots more that I really want to go into, and I appreciate that scientific delineation that you just provided, and for getting questions from some of our listeners as well, which I want to have time for. But I want to get your take on the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I've been thinking, what does Lustig have to say about this? And now we'll find out. I mean, I'm sure that, like many of us, you look at his kookiness on vaccines and his whole history, and it may be alarming to you like it is to many of us. But he's also been going after things that you've been going after, some of the things that he's done. And, he has a real record on environmental law that's pretty sterling in some ways. So your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll be very honest with you, Michael. This is as complicated as it gets. And I've wasted 5 months of sleep over this entire issue.
You and my wife losing sleep over this appointment.
Damn right.
Absolutely in common.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because the election was on November 5th. And on November 10th, I received a phone call from the Trump transition team asking me if I wanted to be the head of the NIH.
Wow.
And I said no. And the reason I said no was because I couldn't adopt the entire RFK portfolio. So I knew he was going to be HHS secretary. Trump said
You knew
so.
back then, yeah.
Well, he said so. He said he was appointing him HHS secretary. The point is, in this administration, you can't argue. Okay, you got to take the whole portfolio lock, stock, and barrel. And I couldn't. So look, RFK has 5 buckets in his portfolio. Let's talk about them. Food. Hey, I'm on board. Pharma transparency. I'm on board. Chemicals in the environment. I'm on board. Water fluoridation. I'm partially on board. You could get the fluoride out of the water, but first you got to get the sugar out of the food. Otherwise, everyone's going to get Mountain Dew mouth all at the same time, and that would be even a bigger disaster. Okay, which means that you have to work with the USDA, you have to work with the professional associations like the American Dental Association, you have to work with the public, you have to do a public service campaign. You can't just pull the fluoride out of the water. You got to do it right. But there are plenty of countries that don't have fluoride in the water, and they're just fine, but they don't have the sugar in the food like we do. And then finally, bucket number 5, vaccines. And I could not, in good conscience, as a pediatrician, as someone who has taken care of every single one of those childhood diseases, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, mumps, measles, rubella, polio, H-flu. I could not, in good conscience, adopt that portfolio. And my integrity basically said, don't do this. This is a mistake.
I commend your integrity, just as I commended you when you said you didn't want to be on Twitter anymore.
And I was right about that, wasn't I?
There's similar kind of principles in that way.
You got to go with your integrity.
Well, good for you.
And Michael, you know that better than anybody.
Well, I like to believe I do.
Yes, you do.
We're getting some questions here. Let me go to them, and I'll come back to a number of things that I wanted to come back, including maybe a little devil's advocate. But
Sure.
Frank Covone of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania says, beyond sugar, how concerned should we be about glyphosate in our food supply?
Well, we should be concerned. So the question is, what is glyphosate? It's an amino acid analog. It's an analog of glycine. That's why it's called glyphosate. It gets incorporated into our proteins, and that actually makes our proteins less functional, and it also provides an immunogenic possibility. And so it's not surprising that it would cause metabolic disease and cancer. It's a big concern. Monsanto swept all of this data under the rug for decades, and we have the history on that. And bottom line is that's one of the reasons why Monsanto got sold to Bayer, because they couldn't afford the lawsuits. And it's a problem. It's a huge problem. And glyphosate doesn't just stay where you put it; it goes everywhere. So even the things that say they're organic, the glyphosate, travels in the air. It's a big problem.
And Susan Pendleton from Fresno, thank you for the question. Susan says, in California, all students are provided lunches. The lunches are often full of ultra-processed food. Is this propagating the sugar problem at a scale, a development time that is very important?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. So the answer is absolutely. But here in California, as you know, we passed a law that reduced added sugar to 5% of total calories within foods. Nancy Skinner of the California State Legislature introduced that bill 2 years ago, and it was actually co-authored by my nonprofit, Eat Real, and my colleagues Nora Latoria and Natalie Linden at Eat Real. I'm the chief science officer of that. Our goal is to get real food into K-12 nationwide, ultimately worldwide, but we have to, start small, and we're doing it district by district, and we're doing it here in California. And get this, we just did an analysis along with Michael Gorin at University of Southern California of the schools that have basically subscribed to Eat Real over the last 5 years, and we are improving English and math grades in those schools. So take that.
Well, that must feel really good.
You're damn right it does.
And let's talk at least for a moment about ultra-processed foods, because I'm looking at a paper here. It says, in fact, the definitions are too imprecise. Nutritious foods such as commercial whole grain bread may be considered ultra-processed due to the degree of processing, such as milling of grain. But such foods should not be automatically associated with the same negative health outcomes as foods that have significant levels of added sugar, saturated fats, and salt, and in fact, a number of products that have been shown to be beneficial.
All right.
There's a lot of confusion about the observations that have been done. Some states actually asking agencies to research whether there is convincing evidence to harm from ultra-processed foods as currently defined, which many top food scientists believe is problematic because the definition doesn't advance our understanding of the way we promote public health.
So you've just mentioned a whole bunch of things all at once.
A lot that's packed in there, I realize, but it boils down to, are ultra-processed foods really as dangerous, and is it really well defined for us what they are?
Mega question. So the answer is there's several definitions of ultra-processed food, and it depends on who you read. The most common definition of ultra-processed food is the one that was developed by Carlos Monteiro, who's a public health epidemiologist at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil.
He's the 4-level guy, right?
He's the 4-level guy, the NOVA classification. So for your audience, let's explain NOVA. The easiest way to explain NOVA is with an example. Let's take an apple. NOVA class 1 would be an apple picked off a tree. NOVA class 2 would be apple slices, destemmed, seeded, deskinned. NOVA class 3 would be apple sauce, macerated, cooked with preservative added, possibly with added sugar. NOVA class 4 would be a McDonald's apple pie. Now, the question is how much NOVA class 1 apple is in that NOVA class 4 McDonald's apple pie? And the answer is only McDonald's knows for sure. When you look at the data that this classification derived from multiple data sets from around the world, what you see is that NOVA class 1, class 2, and class 3 generate no signal in terms of disease. All the disease is in NOVA class 4. the ultra-processed food category. Now, is all ultra-processed food bad? And the answer is no. What makes ultra-processed food bad? That's what it comes down to. And the answer is three things. And we actually did this exercise using a food company in the Middle East called Kuwaiti Danish Dairy. We actually analyzed their entire portfolio, analyzed all of the ingredients they imported, all the products that they made, sent them for biochemical analysis, and worked backwards and reverse engineered everything to figure out what the principles of detriment from ultra-processed foods were. And I can sum them up in 3 precepts and 4 strategies. Here are the 3 precepts. Protect the liver, feed the gut, support the brain. Those 3. Now, why those 3? Because the literature, the data in the literature says that if you fix those 3, the downstream organs of those 3, like for instance, the heart, the pancreas, the kidney, they get better. Whereas if you try to fix the heart, the pancreas, and the kidney, the liver, the gut, and the brain don't get better. So they must be downstream. They must be secondary. The gut, the liver, and the brain are primary. So any food that does all 3, whether it's ultra-processed or not, is healthy. Any food that does none of the 3, ultra-processed or not, is poison. And any food that would be somewhere in the middle would be somewhere in the middle. Now, what strategies does the food industry undertake to basically destroy those 3? And the answer is adding sugar, removing fiber, no omega-3s, because omega-3s go rancid, and finally, emulsifiers, because they're causing gut inflammation. Those are the 4 principles that you could basically fix in ultra-processed food in order to make them healthy. So in Kuwait, we have worked with this company, Kuwaiti Danish Dairy, over the last 5 years. By the way, I take no money for this, so no conflict of interest. And what we have done is we have turned over 10% of their portfolio. They have 180 items in their SKUs. We have turned over 18 items to be metabolically healthy, and we've tested them in people to actually demonstrate that by addressing these 3 principles: protect the liver, feed the gut, support the brain. So can ultra-processed food be healthy? Yes, if you adhere to those 3 principles. Right now, no American company is adhering to anything. So in our country, ultra-processed food is poison. Does it have to be? No. I'm trying to get the food industry to wake up and smell the coffee.
Well, I just read an article in the Journal of Preventive Medicine that says 50% of the American diet is ultra-processed food.
More than that, 62.
And there's a lot of premature death that can be obviously linked to that, and that's the
Absolutely.
conclusion of the study.
Indeed.
But I wish we had a better definition of what ultra-processed food is in people's minds.
It's complicated. Let me explain one of the problems. Everybody points to grains as being the big issue. Okay, so there's this thing called whole grain bread, and people say that whole grain bread should not be considered ultra-processed. Well, whole grain bread could be or couldn't be, depending on what happened to that whole grain. So, is a whole grain in whole grain bread in America actually whole? And the answer is FDA and USDA don't even have a definition for whole grain. So what does the food industry do? They take that whole grain, they pulverize it, they turn it into a fine flour, so you end up with brown bread. But they had to pulverize the husk, the bran that surrounded the wheat berry in the first place. It turns out if you swallow the wheat berry whole, the enzymes in your intestine have to strip that wheat berry bran off. It takes like 2 hours to do that. And by that time, that wheat berry is halfway down your intestine. And the microbiome will chew up the glucose in the starch in that wheat berry at that point. So you didn't even get it because the bran, the kernel, the husk, was a delivery vehicle. But when you pulverize it, then all of that glucose is free in the duodenum. You absorb it quickly. It goes straight to your liver, drives fatty liver disease, drives chronic metabolic disease, drives insulin resistance. Yet both of those, the wheat berry that was intact and the wheat berry that was pulverized, are both called whole grain. So, I have been arguing that the USDA has to get their friggin' act together. And of course they won't, because, the USDA is really just a pawn of the food industry. It is a regulatory capture. They don't want to label anything because, God forbid, they should, because then, profits would go down.
Are they concerned at all, really, with metabolic health? I mean, that's really been your major concern in many ways. You mentioned microbiome.
Yeah.
I mean, that too seems to be of major concern, at least from the papers that they put out and everything. They talk about sugar changing the way the brain works, just as you do, and things of that nature.
Yeah. Well, the USDA has zero interest in metabolic health whatsoever. None. Zero. Zilcho. Nada. Now, the FDA had some interest, but they were not able to, shall we say, influence the argument or the conversation. This, of course, is one of the things that RFK Jr. has railed against the most, and one of the reasons why he has fired the entire nutrition unit of the FDA, because they, quote, weren't doing their job. Now, was that a good idea or a bad idea? I'll leave that to you.
You make it easy to decide. Also, like I say, I want to do a little devil's advocate here, but before I do, I was just thinking, we just had a trip to Japan, and I was thinking of my old friend who you probably knew, Dina Dell, who used to say that, the Japanese eat the way we should eat in America, and they do have a lifespan still of around 88,
Indeed.
Which speaks for itself, I guess, and they don't have the health problems that we have.
Indeed. That's exactly right. And the reason is because they eat real food. Now, there are plenty of Japanese who don't. Let's be very clear. Okay, ultra-processed food's a big deal in Japan too. But the fact is, if you look at the older Japanese, they eat like they always ate. What do they eat? They eat fermented, vegetables. They eat fish. They have a little rice. And they are doing just fine. And we have an 8-year lifespan deficiency compared to Japan. We are paying an 8-year longevity tax to Japan because of our diet. And if you're obese, you're paying a 15-year longevity tax. And if you have metabolic syndrome, you're paying a 20-year longevity tax. We could recoup that tax if we fixed the food.
Do we know that fructose is toxic? Have we ever proven it?
I think so. Lots of people think so. There was a paper that came out just about 2 years ago called Sweet Death, Fructose and the Gut-Brain Axis. Okay? I didn't write that paper. I mean, they called it Sweet Death. Okay? Fructose is a dose-dependent mitochondrial toxin. Now, glucose, which is half of sugar, is not. Glucose is the energy of life. Glucose actually improves and stimulates mitochondrial function.
So when people say sugar gives me energy, they're talking about the glucose, aren't they?
Well, no, they're talking about the fact that it is 4 calories per gram, and they think somehow that's related to your energy. No, that's what happens inside a bomb calorimeter. Okay, so yes, glucose, fructose, 4 calories per gram, protein, 4 calories per gram, fat, 9 calories per gram, which is how fat got demonized and, as bad, because it's so much more energy dense. Therefore, it must be the cause of obesity because it carries more energy with it, because that's what happens in a bomb calorimeter. Okay, well, you know what? We're not bomb calorimeters. A bomb calorimeter basically looks at how many calories any given food has. And so what's a calorie? A calorie is that amount of energy that raises 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. Okay? So it is a measure of heat. Now, when you eat, you generate heat. 40% of what you eat comes off as heat. It's the reason you have body heat. It's the reason you are at 98.6, except you are not at 98.6. For the last 150 years, American body temperature has been going down so that we are now 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than our ancestors were 150 years ago. And the reason can't be because of the food we eat. Let me take that back. The reason can't be because of air conditioning or the environment. The reason has to be because of mitochondrial dysfunction. It's the only thing that explains a reduction in body heat. So the fact that we are generating less body heat means we have mitochondria that don't work as well as they used to. And the question is, what's causing that mitochondrial dysfunction? And the answer is a lot of things. I'm not saying it's one thing. It's a lot of things. Okay, so it's air pollution. It's chemicals in the environment. Okay, it's ionizing radiation, as we've learned from getting urine from astronauts. Okay, and it's also our food, and very specifically this molecule called fructose, because fructose inhibits 3 enzymes that are necessary to generate that ATP, to generate that heat. Those 3 enzymes are, just for the scientists who are listening, because I know you have some, AMP kinase, which is the fuel gauge on the liver cell, ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is necessary to cleave the fatty acids into 2 carbon fragments so that they can be oxidized. And finally, CPT1, carnitine palmitoyltransferase 1, which is the enzyme that regenerates carnitine, which brings the fatty acids into the mitochondria in the first place. The sum total means that fructose inhibits burning. It inhibits mitochondrial function. Okay? Anything that inhibits mitochondrial function is a toxin. Okay? The most famous of which you mentioned at the top of the show, cyanide. Is cyanide a toxin? Damn right. It just works in parts per billion. Well, fructose works almost the same way. It just works at parts per thousand.
So forgive me, let me go back for just a moment to that interview I did with Jim Watson many years ago. Mm-hmm. Because he was talking about his mitochondria being Norwegian. He was putting it almost in a genetic contetic. That's my longevity was what he was saying.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's why. The mitochondria are longevity, but it has nothing to do with being Norwegian.
Here's Alex, who says, is a calorie, or is that a Coca-Cola marketing campaign?
That is a Coca-Cola marketing campaign from 2013 called Coming Together, and it was very specifically designed and devised to assuage the public about Coca-Cola's complicity in the obesity epidemic.
So I said I was going to be devil's advocate with you, Bob.
You bet.
And
I'm ready.
Well, I came across, sounds like a very strange guy because I was reading about his life, and I won't go into that, but this guy, Joey Lott, who wrote a book called In Defense of Sugar. Do you know this book?
No, I don't.
Well, the basic thesis is sugar is a scapegoat. It's a nutritional devil, that's become, for those like you who have inveighed against it, something that evidence doesn't really, especially high fructose and what we're talking about here. Corn syrup is part of consumption, but people are getting fatter not because of that. It's because,
because of why? What does he say it's from?
He seems to say it's certainly not. It's a lie that it's coming from sugar. It's just not coming from sugar.
Yeah, where's his data? At UCSF, we have a saying, in God we trust, everyone else has to produce the data. I've produced the data. Let me see his.
Well, this is an interesting notion, though. He says if early humans would have died, they would have all died from tropical fruit, if fruit was dangerous because of the sugar in fruit. Brings up that whole question about...
Oh, that's garbage. That's just garbage.
Sugar and fruit and so forth.
Yeah, all right. So let's do sugar and fruit. All right. So here's the question. How much sugar's in an orange? Not that much. Okay? It's sweet, but it's not that much. Okay? How much sugar's in a glass of orange juice? 6 times as much. Because it takes 6 oranges to squeeze to get an 8-ounce glass of orange juice.
How much sugar is in mangoes, though? I mean, that's a lot.
It's about the same as oranges. The fact of the matter is, if you did a scattergram between the amount of sugar and the amount of fiber in any fruit, it would be in diagonal. The more
including
sugar,
bananas?
so except for bananas and grapes. So we'll put them to the side for a moment. Take the rest of the entire plant kingdom, okay, and go sugar against fiber. They all fit on the diagonal. Okay, the things that have the most sugar also have the most fiber. Perfect example, sugar cane. It's a friggin' stick. You can't even chew the friggin' thing. Okay, how about pineapple? Lots of fiber. Okay, lots of sugar, but lots of fiber.
You're one of the few scientists I know who uses friggin' frequently, by the way.
Well, I'm from Brooklyn. I can't help it. You want to talk about devil's advocate? Okay, we can talk about that.
We can't put you back on public radio with that word.
No, I know. Anyway, bottom line, the fiber is actually protective, because what the fiber is doing is it's forming a barrier on the inside of the intestine, preventing absorption from the gut into the bloodstream. Think of it like this. There's soluble and insoluble fiber. Okay, real fruit has both. The insoluble fiber, the cellulose, the stringy stuff in celery, acts like a fishnet. And the soluble fiber, which are globular, plug the holes in the fishnet. And so together, they form an impenetrable barrier so that you can't get the sugar across and into the bloodstream. And so it actually mitigates and reduces the glucose, the fructose, and therefore the insulin response. So you stay metabolically healthy, and fiber has been shown to basically reverse metabolic syndrome all by itself. And because you didn't absorb it early, it goes further down the intestine where the microbiome can chew it up. And so it improves microbial diversity. The soluble fiber acts as the substrate for the colonic bacteria to turn it into short-chain fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory, anti-Alzheimer's. Okay? Basically, save your life. So, in fact, what you are doing is you are protecting the liver and you are feeding the gut. And because of the short-chain fatty acids, you are also supporting the brain. So the fiber is actually the good part of the fruit. The sugar or the juice is actually the bad part of the fruit. So the fiber is basically, the juice is basically nature's way of getting you to eat your fiber. The problem is we're not eating our fiber. We're throwing it in the garbage.
And I think you've pretty much demonstrated with your data that sugar actually changes the way the brain works.
Indeed.
Literally. But
literally.
I want to get back to some of these differences that some of your detractors and those who advocate.
I will even go so far, Michael, that we now have the data to say that sugar is not the, but a primary cause of Alzheimer's disease. And by the way, everyone is referred to on May 20th, so just 3 weeks from now. I don't know when we'll air this, but 3 weeks from now, there will be an Alzheimer's Prevention Day, okay? And you can find it at alzheimersprevention.info. And there are basically 3 things that you can do to prevent 80% of Alzheimer's disease. 3 things. Get rid of the sugar, add omega-3s, add B vitamins. That's it. All nutritional.
It's a good trinity to remember. Easy.
80% of Alzheimer's down the tubes.
Wow.
From those 3 things alone. So, the guy who says that, sugar's fine, I'll debate him any place, anytime, and I will win. Swear to God.
Yeah, it's like Stan Glantz used to say, I'll debate anybody from the tobacco industry. The problem was nobody from the tobacco industry would step up and debate. I think
Same
you
thing.
have the same kind of problem. But what do you
do.
What do you say to these people who say, you have a balanced diet and natural sugars are healthy and it depends on individual metabolism and all those kinds of arguments?
Garbage. So, number one, natural sugars are not healthy per se. The molecule's the same. Okay? So we're talking, glucose. We're not talking about glucose. We're talking about fructose here. So what are the fructose carriers? They are sucrose, table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar, the stuff you put in your coffee, high fructose corn syrup, maple syrup, honey, agave. In equimolar doses, those are all the same. They're all detrimental. Now, there are things you can do to mitigate the damage, like reduce dose, or add fiber so that you reduce absorption, or exercise so that you increase mitochondrial beta oxidation by having more mitochondria. Those are all things that you can do to try to mitigate the negative effects of that fructose. I'm not saying that you're powerless. You're not. But the molecule itself has proven itself to be a dose-dependent mitochondrial toxin, not just in the test tube, not just in animals, but in humans. And we have the data. And it's not correlative data, it's causative data. You want it? I'll give it to you.
It's in print?
Oh, yeah, sure. Loads of it.
I mean, we can maybe tell people where to look and where they can find them.
Well, the easiest way is to go to my book, Metabolical, where I list it all.
It's in there, yeah.
It's in there. Oh, it's in there. And we have more now, even since Metabolical's been published. Metabolical is now 4 years old. Okay, there are whole bunches of studies. There's going to be a Frontiers in Psychiatry that's going to come out on food addiction, and we're going to have all of the data on how sugar's addictive in that volume as well.
Is there such a thing as a sweet tooth?
Of course, it's sugar addiction until proven otherwise. 20% of Americans say, "Oh, I have a horrible sweet tooth." Think of it this way. Okay, let's switch substrates for a minute. Let's talk about alcohol. 40% of Americans are teetotalers, never touch the stuff. 40% are social drinkers, can pick up beer and put it down. I'm in that category. 10% are binge drinkers, and 10% are chronic alcoholics. So 20% of America has an alcohol problem. Now, what distinguishes those 20% from the 40% that are social drinkers or the 40% that are teetotalers? We still don't know. We do not know the answer to why those people are binge drinkers and chronic alcoholics.
Well, there's certainly some who suggested genetics at one point, remember?
Yeah, except we've looked for the genes. Okay? We've looked for the genes for cigarette smoking. We've looked for the genes for alcoholism, and no one's found them. Okay? And believe me, it's not like we haven't tried. Some of this stuff may be not genetic, but some of it may be what we call epigenetic. Okay, modifications of DNA. And, that might be the case. And I'm not arguing that. And so, it may go along with genetics, but it's not in and of itself an alteration in the DNA sequence. Okay, it's not a mutational phenomenon. It may be something else, something that you're exposed to. And we can talk about epigenetics, ad nauseum. We'll never get the final answer on that.
It's a fascinating topic.
It is. Oh, absolutely it is. Here's an interesting tidbit that came out in November of this past year. I love this one. They looked at UK babies that were born before 1953 and after 1953. Why 1953? Because that's when their sugar rationing ended. Okay? And so those babies are now not just adults, but they're seniors, 1953, right? Okay, they're over 70. And so they're starting to drop. And so the question is, what are they dying of? And it turns out that the babies born after 1953, when sugar became plentiful again, have 3 times the incidence of hypertension and heart disease and diabetes. Now, how do you explain that? If anything, it should be like,
prima facie,
when food became more available, you should be more nutritious, right? Yeah. Bullshit, garbage. Okay. The fact of the matter is the toxin was being withheld. And in fact, we have these data from numerous animal studies and other human studies as well, that those countries that have lower sugar availability have lower incidences of diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Okay. Now, those are correlative. This one's causative. This one's what we call an econometric analysis, which demonstrate causation. So anybody who wants to give me a hard time about this, okay, bring them forward and, we'll have it out. Okay. I don't want to be bullying, but I'm going to tell you, your data ain't going to hold up.
Hasn't high fructose declined in consumption, though, and people are getting fatter anyway? That's another one of the arguments you hear.
Yeah. No, I've heard that argument a zillion times also. It's the argument that the food industry uses. No question about that. And it is true that we reached a peak consumption of sugar in 2004 of 124 pounds per person per year. We are now down to 94 pounds per person per year. So there has been about a 25 to 27% reduction over the course of the last 20 years. That is true. And yet obesity continues up anyway. So that's what the food industry says. Well, it can't be. Well, it turns out that obesity, first of all, is due to a lot of things. If you did diabetes, it would be very different in terms of the numbers. But if you look at obesity, the function of sugar availability / consumption and obesity turns out to be a more complex function. And you'll have to look at 2 years in a row. This is work out of University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, came out in 2021, where they actually demonstrated the function and used the state of Wisconsin as the test case to demonstrate that if you alter the equation to include 2 years running, it actually explains the change in that state completely. So this notion that the correlation between sugar consumption and obesity is not perfect is actually kind of a canard.
What do you say, because you become kind of a food guru, for better or worse, and what do you say, for example, about things like gluten, which helps with celiac disease, but some people are saying demonizing gluten the way that they say you demonize sugar?
Yeah. So look, I'm a scientist. You got to prove everything to me. I don't take anything on face value. In 2013, I started having GI problems, and I didn't know why. And I went to see the adult gastroenterologist at UCSF, and they did colonoscopy, and they ran all my lab tests, and I did not have celiac. My TTG and IgA were negative, et cetera. They gave me rifaximin, which is an intestinal antibiotic that doesn't get absorbed, in order to sterilize my gut. And it helped for about 6 months. And then it came back again, all this, GI difficulty. And I was spending my entire life in the friggin' bathroom. I was not a happy camper. I was invited to a meeting in 2018, 5 years later. And there were two keynote speakers, me and this other guy. Now, the other guy, his name was Stefano Guandolini. And he was the head of Peds GI at University of Chicago. He was one of the original celiac researchers back in Italy who figured out the whole TTG-IgA hypothesis. And they recruited him from Italy to Chicago. He's been there for 35 years as head of the division. He's a smart guy. And so he gave the other talk, and he basically talked about celiac, which I know about because I'm an endocrinologist, and type 1 diabetes and celiac go together. So I know that. But then he spent the rest of the time talking about this other thing called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which everyone says they have and which no one can prove. Well, they've proven it. So here's what he did. You take white blood cells from a patient with celiac. You put them in the dish. You throw wheat on them. They go bonkers. You throw gluten on them. They go bonkers. You throw rye on them. They go bonkers. You throw barley on them. They go bonkers, just like you'd expect. You take white blood cells from somebody like me, who does not have celiac, but who has symptoms. You put them in the dish. You throw wheat on them, they go bonkers. You throw gluten on them, nothing happens. You throw rye on them, nothing happens. You throw barley on them, nothing happens. Only wheat, not gluten, only wheat. So the question is, what's going on there? Turns out wheat is a very complex organism. It has 700 different antigens. Two of them are the ones that make up gluten, glutenin and gliadin. And if you're allergic to either of those, you have celiac. But you can be allergic to any one of the other 698 proteins, and it won't show up in that test. And it won't even show up in a small bowel biopsy, but you're still sick. So I went off wheat. And 1 month later, all of my symptoms went away. And they've stayed away for the last 7 years. And I've tested myself every once in a while. And every time I test myself, I pay dearly.
Yeah, I may have to do the same thing because I've had similar problems, gastrointestinal. Maybe go off wheat and
try go off wheat.
See
try
results.
Going off wheat.
Yeah.
Now I can have a beer, no problem. Okay, because it's barley. Okay, but the fact of the matter is, if I stay off wheat, I am perfectly fine.
We've visited this before in dialogue, but I'm interested in, again, sugar as an addiction, because there are people who remain skeptical. They say, I crave sugar, but I don't think of myself as being a heroin addict or anything that resembles what we would call addiction.
Right.
Where's the data there again?
Yeah. So number one, it's not a strong addiction. I mean, it's not like, heroin. Okay. That's a strong addiction. Okay. Sugar is a much weaker addiction. And also, heroin has tolerance and withdrawal. Okay, so tolerance is more and more for less and less. The law of diminishing returns. All right, withdrawal are physiological symptoms related to abstinence. That's withdrawal. Turns out all those physiological symptoms are all peripheral. They're all things like, sweating or GI side effects or eye mydriasis, your pupils going like this, with heroin. Bottom line, they're all peripheral. But really, addiction is not peripheral, it's central. So all of those compounds that we say are addictive, they all have peripheral effects like cocaine, heroin, caffeine, nicotine. They all have peripheral side effects. Sugar does not have peripheral side effects, at least not acute peripheral side effects. It has lots of chronic metabolic side effects that we've talked about, like fatty liver, but you can't feel that. So in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association changed the definition of addiction. It used to be tolerance and withdrawal. Now they've changed it to tolerance and dependence. And there are 9 criteria for dependence, and sugar meets all of them. So tolerance, we knew that before. It's the withdrawal that was the issue. And, sugar does not generate a standard withdrawal phenomenon.
Are they all the same, Bob? Natural sugar, cane sugar?
Yeah, they're all the same. They're all the same. Okay. But there are plenty of things that are addictive that don't generate withdrawal. Like, for instance, gambling, shopping, internet gaming, social media, pornography. Those have no withdrawal syndrome either. Those behaviors, because there's no chemical involved, those behaviors are still addictive, but they meet the criteria of tolerance and dependence. Well, it appears that sugar meets those same criteria of tolerance and dependence.
I don't know. I've heard shopaholics say they were withdrawing.
Maybe so. More dependence than anything. But yeah, the bottom line is we have the data. Ashley Gearhart at the University of Michigan developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and it's been very useful in terms of understanding both the demographics and the procedural aspects of food addiction. I just wrote an article for this volume in Frontiers in Psychiatry called The Battle Over Food Addiction, and what the naysayers, provide to try to counter the argument. Ultimately, they say that sugar can't be addictive because it's a food. So that's the question, Michael. Is sugar a food?
Well, you've said on a number of occasions it's not a food, but
it's not a food.
Let me go to another naysayer.
It's a food additive.
There's a guy named Edward Amber, University of Alabama. I don't know if you've heard of him or read of him. He said you can't overdose on sugar, but it's a fundamental building block of food.
It is not a fundamental building block of food. Where did you get that from?
I agree with you, but this is what Edward Amber said.
Where the hell did he get that from? It is not. There is no biochemical reaction in any vertebrate organism that requires fructose. It is completely vestigial to human life.
Let me read you Edward Amber. Your head may blow off when you hear this. Edward
Probably.
Says, everything living depends on sugar to survive, and would
glucose.
And he adds, he's a culinary guy. He adds flavors to so many different things as well, which probably is true. But let's go back to his argument here that it's a building block of life. Where do you come up with that? He describes it, in fact, as kind of a what does he say about it? It's like one of these special tools that can be used in so many different ways and so forth. What a metaphor for sugar.
Glucose is the energy of life. Glucose is essential, but glucose is still not essential to eat, because your body will make it. So the Inuit, the Rendili, the Maasai, the Tokelau tribes, they had no access to glucose because they couldn't grow a carbohydrate. The Inuit, they had whale blubber, okay, but they still had a serum glucose level because the fat and the protein can go to the liver and get converted to glucose. And glucose is necessary for all sorts of phenomena in the cell, including glycosylation of receptors and what have you. If you don't glycosylate your proteins, you have something called congenital disorders of glycosylation, which as an endocrinologist, I take care of. And it's a friggin' disaster, one of the worst genetic diseases there is. So God knows glucose meets that definition and criteria.
I mentioned before to you that
fructose does not.
I have diabetes, and when I had to go on prednisone, my glucose shot up like out of this world. And what it does actually is, what it did in my case is made me avoid a lot of the unhealthy foods that really were shooting up my blood sugar.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. And, prednisone's famous for that. One of the reasons is because prednisone causes massive insulin resistance.
Yeah.
And so, it becomes a major issue as to how are you going to deal with the insulin resistance while you're on prednisone? The question, of course, the question to your doctors is, did you need the prednisone? It depends on what the disease was. Was there another way of dealing with it, other than prednisone? As an endocrinologist.
Can prednisone lead to roid rage, by the way? It is a steroid.
Oh, absolutely, of course. And the reason it does that is because cortisol causes hypermetabolism in the brain. It causes neurons to require more ATP because it increases the rate of ATP utilization, because it's basically heat shock proteins, basically telling your neurons they need to adapt to stress. And so they end up burning more energy, which means that the mitochondria of those neurons have to be able to generate that ATP. If they are defective in any way, if they are dysfunctional in any way, then you end up ATP depleted, in which case you end up with brain fog as a, sort of baseline dysfunction. You end up with inability to form memories and defective cognition as a secondary dysfunction. And you can go all the way to psychosis, including roid rage and even, depression and schizophrenia, all from excess glucocorticoid because of this mitochondrial dysfunction that we doctors are not aware of or dealing with, but we have the data. In fact, we're going to have a symposium at UCSF in September on exactly this topic.
Well, I always learn a lot from you and always appreciate having you in dialogue. And I want to thank all of those who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, all who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. If you aren't a member of the podcast, again, I invite you. In fact, I urge you to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, where you can find all our previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. I also invite you to email me with any reactions, thoughts, or recommendations you may have to mkrasny@graymatter.show. Gray with an E. Thanks to our indefatigable Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and a special thanks to this week's guest, Dr. Robert Lustig.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. My pleasure.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.